Sergeant Scrubs to Trauma Bay 3. Sergeant Scrubs. The overhead page echoed across 3 floors of Sacred Heart. 12 nurses looked up from their charting stations. Some smirked. One actually laughed, a resident from Johns Hopkins who thought he was in on the joke. Dr. Marcus Hayes stood at the nursing station, his hand still on the call button, watching the trauma floor with the expression of a man observing insects under glass. His Ivy League pedigree hung framed behind him, Columbia Medical, top 5%, published in JAMA twice before his 30th birthday. He'd clawed his way from a state school upbringing to this, a trauma surgeon at one of the Pacific Northwest's premier hospitals, respected by administration, feared by residents, and utterly, completely enraged by a former Marine Gunnery Sergeant in Scrubs who'd been on his staff for 6 months and somehow commanded more authority than he'd earned in a decade. The page repeated. Sergeant Scrubs, Trauma Bay 3. Laura Bennett didn't react. Not a flinch. Not a glance toward the call button. She finished hanging the 4 bag on the previous patient, a 73-year-old with a GI bleed, vital stable at last, and moved toward the trauma bay with the same mechanical efficiency she'd brought to every task since arriving at Sacred Heart. Her movements were precise. Economical. Wasted nothing. The Portland nursing staff had mistaken that efficiency for coldness, for distance, for someone who didn't belong in a profession built on emotional labor. They didn't know those movements came from 15 years of Marine training. They didn't know her posture, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward, had been hammered into her by drill instructors at Paris Island and refined in combat hospitals from Anbar Province to Helmand. They didn't know that economy of motion could mean the difference between saving a life and watching it slip through your fingers while you were still thinking about your next move. The trauma bay doors slid open. The smell hit first, antiseptic and old blood and something metallic underneath, the particular scent of a hospital that had seen violence. A 46-year-old male, motorcycle versus semi-truck, ETA 3 minutes. Trauma alert, the automated system had called it. Translation, Laura had 90 seconds to set up a resuscitation bay that might have to hold a man's life together. She moved. The crash cart was already positioned, standard setup. She began checking the defibrillator pads, the 4-access kit, the ventilation equipment. The 14-gauge angiocath needles were laid out in order. The suction tubing was coiled and ready. Her hands moved through the checklist with the fluid precision of someone who'd done it under mortar fire, in the back of a transport helicopter, in a field hospital where the electricity was generator-powered and the closest backup was 40 kilometers away. A younger nurse, Emma, new to trauma, still carrying the nervous energy of someone trying to prove themselves, watched from the corner. "You've done this before," Emma said. "Not a question." "Amham." Laura didn't look up. Her hands continued their work. Steady. Practiced. The kind of steady that comes from muscle memory, from having already survived worse. What Emma didn't see was the single dog tag on a broken chain beneath Laura's uniform, hidden under scrubs that had cost $40 at a hospital supply outlet. One tag. The other was buried at Willamette National Cemetery 3 years ago, laid in a coffin beside a man whose name had been Marcus Bennett Sr., decorated veteran, killed by a drunk driver on IR-5 while coming home from his own shift at a civilian contractor company. The dog tag beneath her scrubs contained his name. The broken chain was how it had come off his body. Laura had been wearing half of him every day since the funeral. She didn't think about that now. She thought about oxygen saturation percentages. She thought about for-access locations. She thought about the fact that the first 10 minutes of trauma care determined whether a patient walked out or got wheeled to the morgue. She thought about the job. Not the pain. Pain was information. Pain was data. You filed it away and moved forward. The motorcycle patient arrived. Compound fracture to the left leg, significant blood loss, consciousness wavering. Laura was already moving, vitals monitoring leads across his chest, blood pressure cuff inflating, pulse oximetry clip on his finger. The monitor beeped its slow, steady rhythm. She was already talking, her voice low and professional. "We've got you. Breathe slow. You're at Sacred Heart. Best trauma unit in Portland. That was when she felt him. Dr. Hayes. His presence entered the bay like a pressure change, like someone had opened a door in an airplane cabin. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel his attention the way you feel a predator's gaze on the back of your neck. Bennett. His voice was smooth. Cultured. The kind of voice that had never needed to project across a chaotic medical environment because people had spent their entire lives learning to listen to it. Excellent setup. Textbook placement. Laura continued working. Her hands moved to the patient's wound, assessing blood loss, checking for compartment syndrome indicators. The leg was swelling. The pressure was building. This would need decompression if it got worse. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," she said. Still moving. Still focused. Still not looking at him. The thing about textbooks, he continued, stepping closer to the bay, is that they're written for people who've studied the material. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Whereas some of us just seem to know things intuitively. The resident who'd laughed at the overhead page now stood at the entrance to the bay. He was watching. Waiting. The message was clear: watch what happens when you show up the attending surgeon. Laura's jaw clenched. Just for a moment. A physical tell, a stress response she couldn't quite suppress. But her hands didn't stop. The full line went in smoothly. She was already calling for the blood work results, already anticipating what the labs would show. "I'd like to know where you trained," Hayes said. "Your file says you were in nursing school in Portland. Where before that?" "Private medical training," Laura said. Her voice was flat. Neutral. A voice that had learned not to carry emotion, because emotion could get people killed in places where the morphine supply was inconsistent and the air support was 40 minutes away. Different context. Doesn't apply here. Hayes smiled. That was the thing about doctors like him. They smiled when they didn't understand something, and that smile meant he was already building a narrative that would comfort him. She'd seen this before, in officers who'd never been downrange, in commanders who had to believe their authority meant something because they'd never had to rely on anything else. Different context, he repeated. "I see. Well, we do things a certain way at Sacred Heart, Bennett. We follow protocols. We respect the chain of command. We don't freelance." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a threat. It was a statement of fact, the way an apex predator might explain the food chain. Laura knew, in that moment, that she had approximately 6 months before something gave. Either she would have to leave, or he would have to make her leave, because this, her presence, her competence, the way the nursing staff looked at her, was an affront to his understanding of how the world worked. But that wasn't now. Now was a patient whose leg was continuing to swell, whose compartment pressure was rising, whose life depended on someone knowing exactly what to do before the tissue damage became irreversible. Laura looked directly at Hayes for the first time. The blood work results came back. Potassium elevated. Myoglobin in the urine. We need to prepare for fasciotomy. Now. If we wait for the swelling to worsen. "I'll make the call," Hayes said. "That's my job. Yours is to keep him stable." She nodded. Turned back to the patient. Continued the work. Hayes left the bay. The resident left with him. Emma stayed, and when she looked at Laura, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Something like recognition. Like she was seeing someone different, someone who'd just proven something without saying a word about it. The trauma patient was stable. The fasciotomy was called for 0900. Laura checked her watch, 0247 hours. She had barely 6 hours before the surgical team would take over. She stood at the bedside for another moment, checking the fall line, confirming the fluids were running at the correct rate, before stepping back. Her shift was nearly finished. The sun was still 2 hours away. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical song, the sound of a place built to hold human suffering, to organize it, to process it into statistics and case files and discharge summaries. She moved through the hospital corridors toward the supply closet. She needed to restock the trauma bay before the day shift arrived. The supply closet was 3 doors down from the nursing station, a narrow space lined with oxygen tubing for bags, medication drawers, and the accumulated medical detritus of a facility that never closed, never rested, never stopped needing things. She was reaching for a box of 14-gauge angiocaths when the door opened behind her. Dr. Hayes stepped into the supply closet. He didn't open the light. He just closed the door and stood there in the darkness with her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that smelled like old money and privilege. "I'm going to be direct with you, Bennett," he said. His voice was quiet now. Conversational. The kind of quiet that made it worse. "You can't keep doing this. Coming in here, setting up bays like you own the place, acting like you know better than surgeons who spent 8 years in training. The staff is starting to follow you. They're starting to look to you before they look to me. That ends. Today. Now." Laura's hand stilled on the box. She could hear his breathing. Could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Could hear, very faintly, the elevator dinging somewhere down the hall. "I'm going to be direct back," she said. Still quiet. Still controlled. Her voice like the barrel of a rifle cooling after sustained fire. "I don't have a choice about how I approach this work. This is what I am. I can't turn it off, and I won't apologize for it." "Then your job hangs by a thread," Hayes said. "Do you understand? One more performance like that in front of my staff, one more time you undermine my authority, and I will personally ensure that you never work trauma again. Not in Portland. Not in Oregon. I have the connections to make sure you never work anywhere." He wasn't bluffing. Laura understood that. He had the connections. He had the credentials. He had the institutional authority that came from being the right kind of person at the right kind of institution. And she had a single dog tag on a broken chain and a son at home who needed her health insurance. Hayes left the closet. The door closed behind him. The light from the hallway disappeared. Laura stood alone in the darkness. She took one measured breath. Then another. Her hands were trembling slightly, something they only did when she let them, when the controls slipped just for a moment. She gripped the edge of the supply shelf until her knuckles whitened. One tear traced her cheek. Cold. Silent. She didn't make a sound. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the darkness, as if the darkness itself were an opponent, something to be defeated through sheer force of will. She restocked the trauma bay. She finished her shift. She drove home through Portland's pre-dawn streets, past the still dark neighborhoods where people slept, unaware that somewhere in this city, a man was sleeping in a hospital bed whose life had been saved by someone he'd never meet, someone he'd never know the true name of, someone he'd dismiss as just another nurse on his chart. And she wore her broken dog tag under her uniform and said nothing. The reassignment notice landed in Laura's hand like a blade. 1947 hours. That was how long she'd been the lead trauma nurse at Sacred Heart before Dr. Marcus Hayes decided her presence violated some unspoken hierarchy that existed nowhere but in his chest. The parking lot stretched between them now, late afternoon sun glinting off windshields, and every person on the trauma team stood frozen behind the ambulance bay glass watching it happen. Laura's shift had just ended. Hayes had waited for that moment deliberately. "General rotation," he said, his voice carrying across asphalt like he was addressing a lecture hall. "Perhaps General MedSurg will better suit someone with your limited qualifications. We wouldn't want enlisted habits contaminating patient care, after all." She took the paper from his fingers. The fluorescent glow from the ER entrance caught the edge of his smile, the kind of smile a man wore when he'd finally found the lever that moved the world. Behind the glass, she could see their faces. The residents he'd groomed. The nurses he'd isolated. The staff members learning in real time what happened to people who earned respect without his permission. Her hand didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench, not visibly. But a single tear traced the left side of her face, unbidden and unwelcome, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "Patients don't care about titles, Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice pitched so only he heard it. "They care about who saves them when you've given up." He flinched. Just barely. A muscle in his neck twitched as though she'd said something impossible, something that violated the basic rules of submission and power that he'd spent a decade enforcing. She turned and walked to her car without waiting for a response, her scrub still damp with another person's blood, her name still on 3 critical charts upstairs, her hand still remembering the weight of human survival. The walk across the parking lot took 43 seconds. She counted them. Behind her, Hayes stood alone on the asphalt, the reassignment notice crumpled in his hand, and watched her go. What he didn't understand, what made his jaw clench with something darker than anger, was that he'd just done the one thing calculated to destroy his position. He'd publicly humiliated someone the staff had begun to trust, and in doing so, he'd revealed the exact mechanism of his control: fear. Cruelty. The weaponization of rank. The next morning, Laura arrived for her first general rotation shift at 0630 hours. The morning briefing unfolded the way it always did, with resident presentations and case reviews, except now the room held a different rhythm. The nursing staff made space for her at the coffee station. The charge nurse handed her assignments with a nod that carried more weight than before. A surgical tech from trauma walked past and said, "We miss you in there, Bennett." Nothing elaborate. Nothing that would provoke retaliation. Just acknowledgement. Hayes noticed. He moved through the hospital corridors with a precision that suggested he was cataloguing every interaction, every sideways glance, every moment his authority was being subtly circumvented by people who hadn't even raised their voices. He found reasons to page her to his office. He corrected her charting in front of residents, minor things, formatting issues, opportunities to suggest incompetence. But it was like trying to puncture a tire that had already proven its resilience. Laura absorbed each correction, took the feedback in writing, and returned to her patients. The staff watched her do it and understood something Hayes had fundamentally miscalculated: respect built in combat doesn't erode under institutional pressure. By 2000 hours, as Laura settled into her shift in the general med-surg rotation, the hospital had developed a particular kind of electricity. The kind that came from watching a power structure begin to destabilize. Hayes felt it. He moved through the ER like a man auditing for threats, and every neutral expression, every moment of professional courtesy extended to Laura registered as a personal betrayal. Then, at 2147 hours, the radios changed everything. The first dispatch came through the trauma channel at high volume, cutting through the ambient hospital noise like a siren through fog. "Sacred Heart, this is Life Flight Dispatch. Inbound military trauma, ETA 8 minutes. Special Forces Major, training accident, training complex south of the city. Crushed left lower extremity, trapped under equipment for approximately 40 minutes. 2 tourniquets already applied. Vitals en route, BP 94/58, heart rate 138, respiratory rate 28, GCS 14. Laura was updating a patient chart in the med-surg pod when she heard it. The words themselves registered. The intonation did. But what caught her attention was the subtext embedded in that dispatch: our military protocol, active duty status, the kind of injury that came with particular complications. She set her pen down with deliberate care and stood. The charge nurse was already moving, already paging the trauma surgeon. Dr. Hayes emerged from his office like a man who'd been summoned to address something beneath him, but his entire posture shifted when he heard military trauma. His chest expanded. His eyes hardened with the particular intensity of a surgeon about to make decisions that would be documented and scrutinized. This was his arena. This was where his credentials mattered more than his personality. The trauma bay mobilized in the efficient choreography of practiced crisis. Anesthesia was called. 2 surgical residents appeared with plastic aprons tied at their necks. The respiratory therapist wheeled in the crash cart. And Laura, reassigned to general rotation, reassigned to the territory furthest from the action, processed a patient with a minor laceration 2 rooms away while sirens wailed across Portland's evening sky. She heard the stretcher before she saw it. The rotor wash sound of movement, the sharp impact of wheels against tile, the controlled urgency of voices calling out vitals. Through the glass partition separating MedSurg from trauma, she watched the Special Forces major roll past. Mid-40s, athletic build even in crisis, dog tags visible and catching light as the team transferred him to the trauma bay bed. His left leg was a map of destruction, swollen beyond recognition, deeply discolored, tourniquets biting into the flesh above and below the knee, the limb wrapped in trauma shears and dressings that were already seeping through. Hayes took command like a general claiming a battlefield. "Get me orthopedic consult, cardiothoracic on standby, vascular is already notified. I want imaging first, full pelvic, femoral series, vascular ultrasound. Let's assess damage before we make any commitments in the OR." His voice carried the tone of a man who believed the solution lay in data acquisition and careful deliberation. Methodical. Prestigious. Slow. Laura returned to her patient's laceration, but her eyes tracked the trauma bay monitors visible through the doorway. The vital signs display was positioned perfectly for her to read from her station, a small angle, a partial view, but enough. The numbers came: heart rate 142, blood pressure recovering slightly to 97/61, oxygen saturation at 92% on 15 liters non-rebreather. The patient was compensating, holding together by sheer physiology, but the mechanism of injury was too severe to support that compensation indefinitely. At 2,203 hours, the ultrasound technician wheeled in the vascular machine. Hayes ordered a comprehensive assessment. No CT yet, imaging would show pressure differentials, and he wanted to establish baseline vascular function first. Smart medicine, conservative, well-reasoned. Except Laura could see something in the patient's appearance that the portable ultrasound wouldn't capture until it was catastrophically obvious. His leg was swelling rapidly beneath the tourniquets. The tissue beneath the skin had a particular tightness to it, a distension that suggested not just traumatic damage but something more specific, more time-sensitive. Compartment syndrome. The word assembled itself in her mind with the weight of recognition. Increased pressure within the muscular compartments of the lower leg, bleeding and edema building pressure against the fascia that couldn't stretch, tissue death accelerating with every minute that passed. It didn't always present immediately. It didn't always show up on imaging the way a vascular injury would. But it was a race against a clock most people couldn't see, and Hayes' careful, methodical approach, good medicine in most situations, was exactly wrong for this one. A senior nurse from the trauma team walked past Laura's station. "Stay in your lane, Bennett. General rotation means general rotation." Laura didn't respond. She finished the laceration. She charted the closure. But her eye stayed fixed on the trauma monitors. At 2,218 hours, the compartment pressure readings came back from the orthopedic resident's bedside assessment. 35 millimeters of mercury. Normal was 15. The resident made a note on Hayes' chart. Hayes ordered another ultrasound series, another consultation, a transfer to the OR scheduled for 2,245 hours, 30 minutes away. That was too long. Laura's hand moved to her chest, to the space beneath her scrubs where the dog tag hung on its broken chain. Cold metal against her fingers. A small anchor. A weight. The last time she'd felt a patient's leg swelling like that, she'd been 23 years old and standing in Fallujah under mortar fire, and a corpsman had handed her a scalpel because the alternative was watching a Marine lose a limb. She'd made one incision along the fascia, a fasciotomy, a simple emergency decompression that took 90 seconds and saved the tissue beneath. They'd called her Reaper 6 in those days. The one who saved who everyone else had written off. "He's going to lose that leg," she whispered to the chart in front of her. Or worse. The ambulance doors burst open at 2,200 hours. 2 paramedics wheeled the gurney through the ER entrance, their voices stacked in controlled urgency. Special Forces Major, 34, crushed right leg from vehicle impact, tibia and fibula fractured in 3 places, significant soft tissue damage. The Major's leg lay swollen to twice its normal size, the skin already taking on a mottled purple tone that made the ER nurses inhale sharply. One paramedic locked eyes with Laura as she stood near the admit desk, still in general rotation scrubs, still reassigned to the margins. Compartment syndrome risk is high. Real high. We're talking 6 to 8 hour window before tissue death begins. He needs OR evaluation now. Dr. Hayes materialized from behind the glass partition of his office, moving with the smooth confidence of a man who had never questioned his own authority. He intercepted the gurney before it reached Trauma Bay 3, his hand raised in that gesture that said, "Wait." "Imaging first," he announced. "We need baseline ultrasound and CT before we commit to surgery. Standard protocol for crush injuries requires diagnostic confirmation." The Major's teeth were gritted, his hands clenched into fists. Pain was data. He knew it. His eyes found Laura's for one fraction of a second, and something in that look, recognition, maybe, or the instinct of one warrior identifying another, made her step forward. Hayes blocked her path with the subtle angle of his body. "Bennett, you're on general rotation. Bay 3 is trauma team only. Find something else to do." The ultrasound machine hummed its mechanical song as technicians wheeled it into position. Laura watched from outside the room, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled. She had performed field medicine in Fallujah under mortar fire with less equipment than this hospital had in a single supply closet, and she could read the danger signs the way most people read subtitles. The Major's compartment pressure was already climbing. Crush injuries released myoglobin and potassium into the bloodstream like an hourglass running backward, and the clock was not a suggestion, it was a sentence. Hayes stood at the bedside, arms crossed, reviewing the ultrasound images with the expression of a man conducting a thorough investigation. 20 doctors and nurses filled the trauma bay, hovering, observing, waiting for his diagnosis. He had summoned them all. That was the thing about Hayes, he understood institutional theater. Every witness was another voice in his defense when he needed one. Laura moved to the supply station outside the bay, her hands mechanically organizing already organized trays of instruments. Her fingers found her dog tag beneath her scrubs, felt the weight of it. Marcus. The name of her husband, dead 3 years. And now a stranger on a table who might become another name, another weight she would carry. She watched Hayes page the chief of surgery with language designed to be overheard. "Just want to ensure we have full consultation before we proceed. I believe in protocol, not heroics." The subtext was louder than the words, "I am careful. I am cautious. If something goes wrong, I was responsible and measured." Laura had seen this before, not in hospitals, but in forward operating bases where commanders built their credibility by moving slowly while people bled out around them. At 01 for 5 hours, the Major's monitor erupted into a symphony of alarms that made everyone's head snap up. His blood pressure bottomed at 70/40, his heart rate climbing past 140. The mottled purple of his leg darkened into charcoal. The swelling had increased so much that the skin looked ready to split open. Hayes spun toward the ultrasound tech. "Repeat the imaging. I need pressure measurements." But the tech was already shaking his head. "Dr. Hayes, compartment pressure is spiking past 65 millimeters of mercury. That's critical. That's tissue death territory." The words hung in the air like a sentence being read. Hayes moved toward the phone, his composure still intact, his voice still measured. "I'm calling vascular surgery. We'll get a consult, we'll confirm the readings, and then we'll proceed to OR. This is not a cowboy situation. This is evidence-based medicine." The room did not move. Nobody ran. Nobody shouted. 20 trained professionals stood in a space 12 feet by 14 feet and waited for a man to finish building his alibi. Laura's vision sharpened. This was the moment, the exact moment when the distance between protocol and death became negotiable. She had seen it before. In Fallujah, in a market square with rounds coming in from 3 angles, she had seen the moment when following procedure meant watching someone die on the way to proper channels. Her feet moved. Her hands moved. Her voice moved. She took one step into the trauma bay. Hayes turned, his eyes narrowing. "Bennett, you are not cleared for this room. You are reassigned." "Security." Two guards appeared in the doorway, their posture shifting into something alert and ready. The Major's eyes were open, locked on hers, and Laura saw it, the recognition of a soldier who knew he was running out of time. His hand moved toward his dog tags, a gesture so small that only someone who understood would catch it. Laura's hand found her own dog tag beneath her scrubs. Marcus. The chain was broken, the other half buried 3 years ago in Willamette National Cemetery. She felt the weight of it, the realness of it, the commandment it carried. Her husband had been a Marine. He had trained her in field trauma. He had shown her how to work when the noise was coming from every direction and the only thing between survival and death was the ability to make one decision and execute it perfectly. She made her decision. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silence. It dropped an octave. It became something different, something that belonged to parade grounds and combat zones and rooms full of people trained to respond to authority. Everyone. Out. Now. She did not shout. She did not raise her voice. She simply changed the frequency of it, the tone, the weight. The command presence moved through the space like a physical force. One nurse moved toward the door. Then another. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether her tone had overridden their instructions. "I said now," Laura repeated, and this time she was already moving toward the supply station, her hands reaching for the scalpel tray. Hayes stepped forward, his composure cracking like glass under pressure. "You have no authority to," Laura turned. Locked eyes. One word, out. Dr. Hayes left. The guards left. 20 trained professionals filed out of the trauma bay like soldiers following orders from someone they had just recognized as actually holding rank. The Major's monitor continued its arrhythmic shriek. His blood pressure was 65/35 now. His leg was the color of infected tissue. Laura's hands moved with muscle memory that belonged to no civilian hospital. She opened the scalpel tray with one hand, her other already sterilizing the skin with chlorhexidine solution that smelled like antiseptic and urgency. The fasciotomy was not a complex procedure, any surgeon could do it. But any surgeon was not here, and this patient had perhaps for minutes before the compartment pressure crushed the blood vessels completely and killed everything in that leg from the knee down. Laura made the first incision. Longitudinal. Medial compartment. The blade moved with a kind of precision that only came from having done this exact procedure while round snapped past your head in Fallujah, while blood ran the wrong direction and time moved in strange increments. The hiss of air escaping the pressurized compartment. The immediate release of pressure. The flood of serosanguinous fluid across the table. Pain was data. This pain meant the pressure was dropping. This pain meant the tissue was getting blood flow again. She opened the fascia. 18 centimeters of clean separation. The muscle bulged through the incision, dark and edematous, but alive. Capable of perfusion. The monitor began to stabilize. The Major's blood pressure climbed toward 80/45. Not normal, but viable. Salvageable. She made the second incision without hesitation. Anterior compartment. Lateral compartment. Her hands moved like someone who had done this before, because she had. The difference was that before, there had been no ventilators hissing in the background, no fluorescent lights overhead, no sense of being in a room where people made decisions based on institutional protection rather than the simple reality of whether a human being would keep breathing. She had completed both fasciotomies in 6 minutes. The monitor steadied. The Major's eyes focused. He was still conscious, still aware, still bleeding but bleeding into space now instead of crushing his own tissue into death. Laura stepped back. Instructed the waiting nurse to call vascular surgery again, but this time with different words. Major's compartment pressure normalized. Fasciotomy complete. He's stable for OR now. She turned toward the door, her breathing controlled, her hands steady, her scrubs wet with blood and fluid and the physical evidence of what just happened. She did not meet Hayes's eyes as she walked past him in the hallway, though she could feel his stare burning the side of her face. She simply moved toward the supply room, her composure intact, her face unreadable, her dog tag settling back into its position beneath her scrubs. The Major was going to keep his leg. He was going to keep his life. And in a hospital full of protocol and procedure and men who built their authority on other people's hesitation, Laura Bennett had just chosen a different path entirely. The choice had been made. The consequences were coming. But they were not here yet. She stepped back from the stretcher. Just one step. Just enough to clear the surgical field as Dr. Hayes's pale hands trembled reaching for the patient chart. The Major's vitals were stabilizing, O2 sat climbing from 68 to 74 to 81, and that should have mattered. Should have. But Hayes wasn't looking at the numbers. He was looking at Laura, at the scalpel still in her gloved hand, at the lateral incision she'd made through skin and fascia with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from textbooks. His jaw clenched. His eyes went flat. That was when she knew the real crisis was starting. He left the trauma bay without a word. Didn't hand off the patient. Didn't acknowledge the 4 nurses now looking at Laura instead of him for direction. He just walked past the observation window toward his office, and the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder in his absence, like the building itself was holding its breath. By 02:47 hours, Dr. Marcus Hayes had made the first call. The phone in his private office, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed diploma from Johns Hopkins hung at precisely eye level when sitting, rang through to Richard Bancroft, Chief of Medical Staff, who owed Hayes a favor dating back 5 years. A malpractice suit. An expert witness testimony that had shifted just enough in Bancroft's direction. The kind of favor that lived in the margins of professional courtesy, unspoken until needed. Richard, Marcus Hayes. I need to discuss a protocol violation in my ER. Serious one. Involves someone acting outside their scope of practice. Hayes's voice carried the calm precision of a man deploying chess pieces. Not angry. Anger was imprecise. This was calculation. A nurse performed a surgical intervention without attending physician authorization. Could have killed the patient. Could have killed us all legally. By 03:06 hours, the second call had gone to Catherine Chen, another board member. A different favor entirely, a daughter's medical school interview, a phone call from Hayes's colleague at Harvard that had tipped the balance. Chen picked up on the third ring, voice rough with sleep until Hayes began speaking. Then she was awake. Fully. Catherine, I'm documenting a serious incident. I need your vote prepared before the hearing. A nurse, Laura Bennett, performed an emergency fasciotomy without authorization. Undermined medical authority in front of the entire trauma team. This is about institutional control and scope of practice. The third call went to Thomas Mercer. A cardiac surgeon. A man who'd needed Hayes's testimony in a wrongful death case 3 years prior. Hayes's account had been generous. The memory was fresh enough. Tom, I'm activating a board action tomorrow. Laura Bennett, RN. Scope violation, insubordination, endangerment. I'll need your support. Hayes didn't ask. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in courtesy, and Mercer understood perfectly. But destroying someone's career required more than board favors. It required history. It required people who'd known her before she became dangerous. By 03:18 hours, Hayes had the Dean of Sacred Heart's nursing school on the phone, Dean Patricia Holloway, who'd reluctantly written Laura's final recommendation 8 years prior. Patricia, I'm investigating a concerning pattern with one of your former students. Laura Bennett. I'm seeing instability. Boundary violations. Behavior that suggests she may not have disclosed certain previous conditions during her application. Hayes's words were precise. Surgical. I need to know if you recall any mental health flags. Any disciplinary incidents. Anything that might explain why she's now performing unauthorized surgeries. Holloway's voice came back uncertain, defensive. Marcus, I wrote her a strong recommendation. She was an excellent student. I understand. But people change. Or perhaps they don't disclose everything. If I were to subpoena her student file, what would I find? The implication hung there like a blade. Subpoena. Investigation. Liability. By 03:34 hours, Hayes had a healthcare attorney from Seattle, a specialist in medical licensing revocation named Jonathan Pierce, on a video call. Pierce was the kind of lawyer who made his living dismantling nurses and mid-level providers. He had a 73% success rate in licensing board proceedings. His hourly rate was $950. Hayes was prepared to spend $75,000 to make Laura Bennett unemployable across the Pacific Northwest. Here's what we're building, Hayes explained, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. Protocol breach. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Operating outside her scope. Creating a hostile work environment through insubordination. Mental fitness concerns. We plant these seeds now, and by the time the licensing board convenes, she's not just fired, she's radioactive. Pierce nodded, making notes. The fasciotomy itself. Was it medically sound? Hayes paused. That was the problem. It had been perfect. Flawless. A fasciotomy that had saved the Major's leg and probably his life. Which meant Hayes couldn't attack the outcome. He had to attack the authority. The intent. The woman herself. Irrelevant, Hayes said. A paramedic can perform a good procedure. That doesn't make it legal. At 04:01 hours, Laura was being escorted to her locker by security personnel, a formality, but a humiliating one. Hospital policy for any staff member under investigation. She walked the back corridors, the ones that smelled like bleach and old linoleum, the ones where nobody would see her. Her shift supervisor had already been notified to bar her from the trauma bay. Her badge access was being revoked within the hour. She opened her locker, the small metal rectangle that had been her corner of the world for 11 months, and began removing things. Her personal stethoscope, the Lippmann cardiology for that had cost her $300 out of pocket. The laminated photo of her son Marcus Jr. at his high school graduation, still in his dress blues from his Naval Academy appointment. And beneath that, taped to the inside of the locker door, a faded photograph of Marcus Sr. in his Marine dress uniform. Vietnam-era photo. Taken before Fallujah, before anything. Before everything changed. She reached for the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the broken chain, one tag in her possession, one tag buried with her husband at Willamette National Cemetery. She almost pulled it off. Almost put it in her locker, a final surrender. Instead, she tucked it back under her collar and kept it. The rain started somewhere between the hospital parking lot and Highway 84. Not gentle rain. Portland rain in February was aggressive, the kind that hammered windshields and pooled on asphalt and made the world feel like it was drowning. Laura drove with both hands on the wheel, the termination letter sitting on the passenger seat, its edges already curling from the moisture that had seeped through her scrub pants when the security guard had handed it to her. The letter was 3 pages. Single-spaced. Citing violations of hospital protocol, unauthorized medical intervention, endangerment of patient safety, failure to follow chain of command, and conduct unbecoming a healthcare professional. The language was precise. Damning. Each word selected by Hayes and perfected by Pierce, who'd sent it via secure email at 0247 hours and billed the revision process as a $4,200 charge that appeared on Hayes's personal card. Willamette National Cemetery opened at dawn. Laura had been there once before, the burial 3 years prior, the flag folding, the 21-gun salute that Marcus Jr. had stood through with his jaw clenched, looking like his father's ghost in a Navy uniform. She'd promised herself she wouldn't come back. Promised that she'd leave that life behind. Promised her husband that she'd keep their son safe from the legacy of the people they'd been. She parked on the wet grass, violation of the no vehicles policy, but nobody was there to stop her, and walked the rows until she found the stone. Marcus Christopher Bennett S.R., My, USMC, Fallujah, 2008. 3 lines. A birth date and a death date and the place where everything had ended. She knelt in the mud and the rain, her scrubs soaking through immediately, her hand shaking as she unfolded the termination letter. The rain dissolved the paper almost on contact. The words bled. The letterhead ran. Effective immediately, your employment with Sacred Heart Medical Center is terminated for cause. I promised you, she whispered. Her voice didn't sound like hers anymore. I promised you I'd leave the war behind, and I couldn't even keep my head down long enough to make it a year. Couldn't work a single year without breaking the rules. Without breaking their rules. I failed us, Marcus. I failed our son. The dog tag pressed against her collarbone, heavy as a stone. Cold. It was the only thing that didn't feel like it was dissolving in the rain. She stayed there kneeling, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she didn't remember starting. The cemetery was empty. The headstones were dark. And somewhere in Portland, a surgeon with an Ivy League diploma was making phone calls that would ensure she never worked in a hospital again. Her phone had started buzzing around 0430 hours. Sacred Heart's main line. Then the administrative office. Then the nursing supervisor. Then the ER charge nurse. 30 missed calls by the time she reached the cemetery. Texts that she couldn't read through the rain and the blur in her eyes. She didn't answer any of them. She knelt at Marcus SRS' grave for 2 hours. Soaked through. Shivering. And when Marcus Jr. finally found her, his car pulling slowly through the cemetery drive, his eyes scanning the headstones until he saw his mother kneeling in the mud, he didn't say anything. He just turned off the engine and got out, carrying something against his chest. Something heavy. Something that looked like a metal case. The rain wouldn't stop. It hammered the cemetery like applause for the dead, and Laura Bennett knelt in the mud with her termination letter dissolving between shaking hands, the ink bleeding into her palms like a confession she couldn't take back. 3 years she'd buried Marcus here. 3 years of visiting on Sundays. 3 years of whispering apologies to a man she'd promised she would leave the war behind for. And now the war had found her anyway, wearing scrubs and carrying a surgeon's ego, and she'd failed him all over again. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. Didn't hear anything but rain and the sound of her own breathing, controlled, measured, the way a combat medic breathes when she's about to lose a patient. But then a voice cut through the storm. Mom. Marcus Jr. stood at the edge of the grave plot, 16 years old and soaked through, his military-issue rain jacket clinging to his shoulders like something borrowed from a future he didn't know he was walking toward yet. In his arms, a leather case. Her leather case. The one she kept locked in the bottom of her closet behind winter boots she'd never wear again. The one that held everything she'd promised herself would stay buried. How did you? Laura's voice broke. The only time it ever did. Your phone. Your calendar. You always come here when you're afraid. He moved closer, rain streaming down his face, his jaw set with something that looked like her own stubbornness. And Mrs. Chen called. She told me what happened. She told me what they did. He opened the case with trembling fingers, his trembling, not hers. Never hers. Inside, service medals gleaming against velvet. A Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. A Purple Heart. Things she'd never shown him because showing them meant admitting she'd been someone before she was his mother. Mom, they need to see these. You don't get to hide anymore. Laura reached for the case. Her hands moved with muscle memory, not medic, not warrior. Mother. She pulled her son against her chest and breathed into his wet hair and felt something inside her chest shift like tectonic plates realigning. The dog tag beneath her scrubs pressed cold against her collarbone. Broken chain. Half a life. The conference room at Sacred Heart's administrative offices felt smaller than it should have. Beige walls. Fluorescent lights buzzing like insects. A mahogany table with 12 chairs, only 6 occupied. the hospital administrator, 2 board members in reading glasses, 1 legal counsel in a 3-piece suit, and Dr. Marcus Hayes sitting with his arms crossed like a man who'd already won the war before it started. He had contacts. He had leverage. He had a network that extended through cardiology departments and surgical societies and the kind of old money contacts that didn't appear on any org chart. What he didn't have was what wheeled through the door at 08 for 7 hours. The Special Forces major sat in a wheelchair with his mangled leg wrapped in surgical dressing, his eyes the color of winter steel, and beside him stood a Marine colonel in dress blues with a folder thick enough to bend light. The major's voice was quiet when he spoke from his chair, but it carried the weight of someone who'd called in airstrikes with that same measured tone. "Reaper 6, he whispered. "That's Reaper 6. The room stopped. Actually stopped. No one breathed. No one moved. The colonel opened the folder and began to read. His voice was parade ground steady, the kind of voice that could move armies. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Fallujah, Gunnery Sergeant Laura Bennett repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to retrieve and treat wounded Marines. Her actions directly saving 14 lives over a 72-hour siege. On July 14, 2008, under sustained mortar attack, she extracted 3 wounded from a collapsed structure while operating with no backup and 2 pieces of shrapnel lodged in her left shoulder. He paused. Looked up. Continued. Sergeant Bennett's actions under fire exemplified the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps and the profession of arms. Dr. Hayes lunged forward from his chair, actually lunged, his face flushed the color of a cardiac arrest, his voice hitting a frequency that dogs probably heard. This is entirely irrelevant theatrical nonsense. Protocol violation is protocol violation. Her medical license doesn't matter. Her past doesn't matter. She broke hospital procedure and the doors opened. A 3-star general walked through them like the space had been waiting for him all along. He was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not because of height but because of presence that made the air pressure change. His uniform carried ribbons that probably had their own ribbons. He moved to the center of the room, saw the open medal case on the table, and came to attention with the precision of 38 years of service. His right hand rose to his forehead in a salute that moved so slowly it took 3 full seconds, and his eyes locked on the Navy Cross like it was the most important thing he'd ever seen. And then a Pentagon liaison stepped through the door behind him, and her voice when she spoke was the voice of people who classified operations and people who declassified them and people who decided which secrets stayed buried forever. For the record, Dr. Hayes, Gunnery Sergeant Bennett's operational designation Reaper 6 remains classified. The 6 operations she participated in under that call sign are sealed under national security protocols. Meaning her actual service record, can never be fully disclosed in any civilian proceeding. Which means you're attempting to terminate someone you couldn't possibly have enough information to judge. Hayes sat down. Not because he chose to. Because his legs stopped working. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part arrived 2 hours later when a nurse practitioner named Stephanie Chen was sitting in a break room scrolling through her phone, and she saw a video. Her phone. Her video. The one she'd shot 3 days ago in the parking lot while the entire trauma staff watched Dr. Hayes demote Gunnery Sergeant Laura Bennett in front of 30 witnesses. 43,000 shares within 6 hours. Hashtag Sergeant Scrubs trending on Twitter. News outlets picking it up. Reddit threads comparing it to every public humiliation ever committed by someone with an Ivy League diploma and a God complex. By noon, the video reached Dr. Catherine Reeves in Seattle. Dr. Reeves had trained Marcus Hayes 18 years ago when he was a medical student with potential and nothing else. She'd written him recommendation letters. She'd invited him to conferences. She'd watched him climb and climb and climb on the backs of people like Laura Bennett, and she'd said nothing because she'd been busy and he'd been far away and it had seemed like someone else's problem. The letter was published in 4 major medical journals simultaneously. Her words appeared on the front of the hospital's website. Her words moved through the medical profession like a shock wave, and every sentence carried the weight of someone who'd built her entire career on the principle that medicine was about healing and not about hierarchy. I trained Marcus Hayes to heal the sick and not to humiliate the broken. I trained him to lead with empathy and not with cruelty. He has failed at the fundamental mission of medicine, which is to serve. He is a disgrace to the Hippocratic Oath, and I disown him as my student, my mentee, and my colleague. Medicine does not have room for people who use power to diminish others. It is a betrayal of everything we are supposed to stand for. The emergency board review began before Hayes' legal team could even schedule their next meeting. 48 hours of testimony revealed 8 other nurses and 3 residents driven out of Sacred Heart over the past 5 years. Files showed retaliatory peer reviews. Documentation proved falsified complaint histories. The board members he'd called with promises and veiled threats began answering his calls from lawyers instead of themselves. The attorney he'd flown in from Seattle withdrew her representation, citing ethical conflicts that would destroy her own practice if she proceeded. His network, the thing he'd built his entire career around, dissolved like salt in water. His Ivy League degree meant nothing to a system that had decided he was the problem. Laura watched him from the hallway outside his office while hospital security packed his belongings into cardboard boxes. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She took one measured breath, and then she turned and walked back to her station with the same quiet dignity she'd worn through every humiliation he'd ever inflicted. He was already disappearing. He was already becoming the kind of person people wouldn't remember. So why waste the energy of even acknowledging his fall? She had a patient to check on. 6 months later, a man who used to wear a white coat pushed a mop across the linoleum floors of the Portland Veterans Affairs Medical Center. His scrubs had no name tag. His medical license had been suspended pending full ethics review. His legal team had negotiated a deal that involved custodial work, 12 months of it, in exchange for avoiding criminal charges for fraudulent documentation and institutional misconduct. He was assigned to the 4th floor where the trauma ward kept its equipment storage. He saw her face once on a hospital newsletter posted in the break room. Gunnery Sergeant Laura Bennett, newly promoted to trauma nursing supervisor, standing in front of something called the Marcus Bennett Senior Memorial Unit. He looked away. At Sacred Heart, the trauma wing's dedication ceremony drew people who wouldn't ordinarily gather in the same room. The general came. The Pentagon liaison came. The Special Forces major came on crutches now, his leg healing but forever changed, like all of them. The Marine colonel stood in uniform. Medical students and residents filled the auditorium because word had spread through every teaching hospital on the West Coast, word that someone had finally been held accountable, and more importantly, that the right person had finally been recognized. Laura stood at the podium wearing her nursing supervisor uniform, and around her neck, visible now for the first time in her 13 years at Sacred Heart, hung her dog tag. The chain was new. Stronger. The single piece of metal caught the auditorium lights and threw them back like a small star. Behind her, on the wall, a bronze plaque read, "The Marcus Bennett S. Art Memorial Unit." Dedicated to those who heal. Dedicated to those who serve. Dedicated to the quiet warriors who ask for nothing but the chance to save lives. She began her lecture on combat trauma integration into civilian emergency medicine with a group of 20 new nurses standing around her in a semicircle. She walked them through the triage protocols she'd developed, the techniques that had kept people alive under fire, the way you prioritize when you have 10 patients and 2 sets of hands. She taught them how to stay calm when the world was bleeding. How to make decisions when there was no time to make them. How to be the person that other people depended on when everything else had failed. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior, she said, and her voice carried like it had carried in Fallujah, like it had carried in that surgical bay at 0200 hours, like it would carry for the rest of her life. You need only the courage to act when others freeze, and the humility to serve something larger than yourself. In the audience, her son Marcus Jr. sat in Navy dress blues, his officer candidate paperwork already signed, already committed, already carrying forward something that couldn't be taught in classrooms. He watched his mother teach these 20 nurses and understood finally what his father had understood when he married a combat medic. That strength wasn't something you demonstrated. It was something you lived. It was something you passed on. The rain had finally stopped when Laura drove to Willamette National Cemetery 3 days later. Her son sat beside her in the passenger seat wearing his uniform, and they walked together to the gray headstone that read Marcus James Bennett SR, and she knelt down and placed flowers, white lilies, his favorite, at the base. She touched the dog tag at her neck. Held it for a moment. The broken chain had been replaced, but she'd kept the brake. Kept it as a reminder. Some things that shatter don't need to be made whole. Some things just need to be carried differently. We made it, Marcus, she whispered. Both of us. Your son's going to be an officer. Your legacy's going to save people. And I'm not hiding anymore. The wind moved through the cemetery, and if you listened closely enough, it sounded like rain that had already fallen, sounded like something finally coming to rest. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.